She was 20 years old and she had nowhere left to go. No living parents, no inheritance, no promise of a bed past the end of the month, just a tin sewing box that had belonged to her grandmother and 11 shillings knotted into the corner of a handkerchief. And with what remained after the coach fare, Mary Weaver bought an unfinished country mansion at the edge of a Warwickshire parish for the sum of £3 sterling. But what nobody in the village knew, and what the solicitor who handed her the deed did not know either, was that behind the plastered wall at the end of the north corridor there lay a sealed wing that had not been opened since the day the builders set down their trowels and walked away, and inside that wing was something that would change the shape of her life entirely. Settle in and stay close for this one, and if you would, let us know in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. Mary Weaver had been born in the spring of 1840 in a narrow brick house on the outskirts of Coventry, the only surviving child of a ribbon weaver named Thomas Weaver and his wife Anne, who had come down from the Pennines as a girl in service and never quite lost the flat vowels of the moors. Thomas was a careful man with slow hands and a good eye for pattern, and for the first 12 years of Mary's life he kept a loom in the front room and a small account at the bank, and the family ate meat twice a week and kept a canary in a wire cage by the window. Anne died of a fever in the winter of 1852, leaving Mary with a small brass thimble that had been her wedding gift, and after that Thomas grew quiet in a way that seemed at first like grief, and later like something heavier, and the account at the bank thinned, and the loom fell silent for weeks at a stretch, and in the autumn of 1858 he was found in his chair one morning with the day's newspaper open on his knees, and his heart, the doctor said, simply worn through. The debts he left behind were not large, but they were more than the house and the loom and the canary's cage could cover, and Mary at 18 was informed by a solicitor in a black coat that her father had died insolvent and that the contents of the house would be sold at auction to satisfy his creditors. She was permitted to keep her mother's thimble, her own clothes, and a tin sewing box that had belonged to her father's mother, and nothing else. She had been apprenticed since the age of 14 to a woman named Mrs. Harriet Gable, a widow of 58 who kept a small dressmaking shop 2 streets away, and who had recognized in Mary, from the first afternoon, a steady wrist and a patient temperament, and the willingness to unpick a seam 12 times if the 12th attempt would sit truer than the 11th. Mrs. Gable had lost her own husband in a factory accident in the year of Mary's birth and had raised no children, and she taught Mary as she might have taught a daughter, without softness but without stinting, showing her how to cut a bodice on the bias, how to set a sleeve so it hung without pulling, how to keep a ledger in a neat hand, and how to speak to a customer who had come in wanting a gown she could not afford. She taught her, too, the practical arts of running a household on very little, how to render fat for soap, how to darn linen so the repair sat flat, how to lime wash a wall, how to mend a broken sash cord, how to boil a nail in vinegar to loosen rust. "A woman who can only sew," Mrs. Gable said once, threading a needle by the window, "eats when there is sewing. A woman who can do a dozen things eats whenever she chooses." Mary remembered the sentence for the rest of her life. The tin sewing box that her grandmother had left was a plain Japan thing, black with a faded stencil of yellow roses on the lid, 8 inches long and 4 wide, and inside were the tools of a lifetime's careful work: a pair of steel scissors with bone handles worn smooth, 3 papers of pins, a wooden bobbin of black thread, a paper of needles, a small measure ribboned in inches, and the brass thimble that had been her mother's. It smelt of beeswax and old cotton, and when Mary opened it in a strange room she felt, however briefly, that she was not entirely alone. She carried it with her everywhere she went after her father's death, first back to Mrs. Gable's shop, where she slept on a folding cot in the back room and worked for board and a shilling a week. And then, when Mrs. Gable herself died in the summer of 1860 of a growth in the stomach that had been silent until it was too late, she carried it into whatever came next. Mrs. Gable had left her, by a scrap of will written in her own hand, and witnessed by the greengrocer, the sum of £4 7 shillings and the shop's account book. But the freehold of the shop had never been hers, and the landlord, a man named Pettifer, who owned 3 streets of Coventry brick, gave Mary a fortnight to clear the premises. She sold the fixtures for what they would fetch, settled Mrs. Gable's small outstanding accounts, and found herself at the end of that fortnight in possession of £6 and 12 shillings, the tin sewing box, a change of clothes, a good wool shawl, and no place in the world that expected her the next morning. She wrote to a distant cousin of her mother's in Yorkshire and had no reply. She wrote to a former customer who had once said, kindly, that if ever Mary should need a position, and received a letter regretting that circumstances had altered. She read the advertisements in the Coventry paper for 3 weeks running, and it was in the 3rd week, tucked between a notice for a lost pony and the sale of a public house, that she saw the small square announcement placed by a firm of solicitors in the parish of Hartwell, offering for immediate disposal the unfinished country residence known as Hartwell Grange, together with such land as pertained, the last owner having died without issue and in debt, and the property to be sold at the pleasure of the vendor for any reasonable sum, however small, to any purchaser willing to take it as it stood. She read the notice twice, folded the paper into quarters, and set it under the tin sewing box on the corner of the small table where she took her meals. For 2 days she did not act upon it, because she had learned from Mrs. Gable that a decision made in the first heat of hope was usually a decision paid for later, and she wished to be certain that what she was feeling was not the mere relief of any prospect at all. On the 3rd morning she went down to the parish clerk's office in Coventry and asked what a solicitor might mean by any reasonable sum, however small, and the clerk, a thin man in a green waistcoat, told her plainly that such phrases were used only when a property was of so little value that the vendor wished chiefly to be rid of the burden of rates and repairs. He said she might offer as little as £1 and expect it to be entertained. She thanked him and walked back through the wet streets to the room above the pie shop where she had taken a bed for 6pence a week after Mrs. Gable's shop was closed, and she sat on the edge of the narrow mattress and counted her money out on the coverlet in 3 small piles, and considered what would be left when she had paid for a coach. That evening, as she was returning from the water pump with a jug for her supper, the woman who kept the pie shop met her on the stair with a small folded paper in her hand and an expression of practiced regret upon her face. Her name was Mrs. Fenn, and she had been civil enough while the rent came in, and she now said that her sister was coming down from Nuneaton on the Friday and would need the room, and that Mary must have her things out by the Thursday evening at the latest. She did not raise her voice, and she did not meet Mary's eye. She pressed the paper, which was a written notice to the same effect signed in a labored hand, into Mary's fingers, and went back down the stair to the shop below without waiting for an answer. Mary stood on the landing with the jug of water in one hand and the notice in the other, and did not argue and did not weep, because there was no one there to argue with, and nothing to be gained by weeping upon a stair, and she went into the room and set the jug upon the washstand, and read the notice through by the light of the window. She had 4 days. She spent the Wednesday writing a short, careful letter to Messrs. Halloway and Son, solicitors of the parish of Hartwell, in which she stated that she was a woman of 21 years, of respectable trade, and that she wished to offer £3 sterling for the residence and land advertised in the Coventry paper, subject to her viewing the property upon arrival, and the deed being clear of further encumbrance. She signed her name Mary Weaver in the small neat hand Mrs. Gable had taught her, and she took the letter to the post office herself and paid the penny for it, and she walked home along the wet pavement with the certainty in her that whatever came of it, she had at least taken the step. On the Thursday morning, a reply came by return of post, briefer than she had dared hope, in which Mr. Halloway the younger stated that her offer would be accepted upon her presentation of the sum in coin at his office in Hartwell, and that the vendor wished the matter concluded within the week. She folded the letter into the tin sewing box beside the thimble and the scissors and the papers of pins, and she began, without hurry and without ceremony, to pack. By the Thursday evening she had done. Her wool shawl was folded on top of her change of clothes in a canvas bag that had once held a bolt of gray lining, and the tin sewing box was tied round with a length of tape and set beside the bag on the bare boards. She swept the room and left the broom against the door where Mrs. Fenn would find it, and she paid the 6pence owing for the last night, and asked for no receipt. In the morning she rose before the light and carried her bag and her box down the stair past the shuttered pie shop, and she walked through the gray streets of Coventry, past the bank where her father had once kept his account, and past the corner where Mrs. Gable's shop had stood and was now let to a man who sold umbrellas, and she came to the coach-yard as the ostlers were putting the horses to, and asked for a place upon the coach that went south by way of Kenilworth to the parish of Hartwell. The fare was 2 shillings and 4pence, and she paid it in coppers counted out upon the wet counter of the ticket office, and she took her seat on the outside, because it was cheaper by half, and because she wished to see the country she was going into. The coach pulled out at 7 in the grey wet morning with 6 passengers, and the driver and a bag of parish mail, and Mary sat with her canvas bag between her boots, and the tin sewing box held upon her lap under the wool shawl to keep the damp from the japanned lid. And she watched the streets of Coventry unwind behind her, and did not look back after the first turning. The road went south through a country flat at first, and then gently rolling, past hedgerows still black with the wet of the night, and fields where the winter wheat was coming up in thin green rows, and rooks were walking in the furrows. It was late October, and the leaves upon the oaks and the hornbeams were the color of copper and dull brass, and the air smelt of wet earth and of coal smoke drifting from the cottages beside the road. They passed a drover moving a small flock of sheep with a black dog at his heel, and the sheep parted round the wheels of the coach and closed behind it, and Mary watched them go and thought of nothing in particular. At Kenilworth, the coach stopped for 20 minutes at a coaching inn, where the horses were changed and the passengers took what refreshment they could afford, and Mary went into the yard and drank a cup of water from the pump, and ate a piece of bread she had wrapped in paper the night before. And she did not go inside the inn, because she had learned that the price of a cup of tea in such places was set by the coat you wore into it. The second stage was longer and colder. A thin rain began about 11 o'clock and did not stop, and the wool shawl grew heavy with it, and the driver upon the box tied a piece of oilcloth over his hat. Mary drew the shawl close about the tin box and let the rain come down upon her bonnet and her shoulders, because there was nothing else to do about it. The country grew lonelier as they went south, the villages further apart, the fields larger, the hedges taller and less trimmed, and once they passed a great park behind an iron railing where deer were standing under the wet trees, and once they passed a ruined barn with the roof fallen in and nettles growing through the floor. She looked at each of these things with the same steady attention, because she did not yet know which of them might have something to teach her about the place she was going to. They came into the parish of Hartwell a little after 3 in the afternoon, and the coach set her down at a crossroads a quarter of a mile short of the village, because the village itself was not upon the coach road, and the driver had another 6 miles to go before his next change. Mary took her bag in one hand and her tin box under the other arm, and she thanked the driver, and she stepped down into the wet grass at the verge and watched the coach pull away south with the rain trailing behind it in a fine gray veil. She stood a moment at the crossroads and looked about her. There was a wooden signpost with the name of the village painted upon it in faded black letters, and there was a lane running east between 2 hedges thick with dog-rose and blackthorn, and there was the smell of wood smoke on the wet air and the sound, very distant, of a church bell striking the quarter. She settled the tin box more firmly under her arm, and she took the lane toward the village. The lane went in gently between its hedges for perhaps a third of a mile, and then it opened, and Mary saw the village of Hartwell laid out below her in a shallow bowl of wet fields, a scatter of some 30 roofs of grey slate and red pan tile, with the square tower of a parish church rising among them, and a stream running behind the churchyard under a stone bridge. She went down into the village and asked at the first cottage door for the office of Messrs. Halloway and Son, and a woman in a stuff apron with flour on her hands pointed her along the street to a narrow brick house with a brass plate at the door. Mary knocked and was shown into a small front room by a clerk of about 15, and Mr. Halloway the younger, a man of perhaps 40 with sandy hair and ink upon his cuff, came in and asked her business. She said her name, and she set the tin sewing box on the edge of his desk, and she untied the tape and lifted the lid, and counted out £3 sterling upon the leather blotter in sovereigns and half-sovereigns and shillings, and Mr. Halloway counted them again and wrote her a receipt in a small, careful hand. He gave her the deed, folded in a paper cover tied with red tape, and a heavy iron key upon a loop of blackened string, and he said that the property lay 3/4 of a mile north of the village, upon the Coates Back Road, and that she would see the gate-posts when she came to them, and would not mistake the place for any other. He asked if she had lodging, and Mary said she had not, and he said Mrs. Bewley at the Ram would give her a bed for 8 pence, and she thanked him and went out. She did not go to the Ram at once. She had 4 hours of light, and she meant to see what she had bought. She walked north along the Coates Back Road with the deed inside the tin box and the iron key in her pocket, and the rain thinning to a fine mist upon her shoulders, and she came in 3/4 of a mile to 2 square gate posts of dressed stone standing on either side of a drive, and between them a pair of iron gates that had not been closed in years, sagging on their hinges into the long grass. Beyond the gates a gravel drive ran between 2 rows of lime trees for perhaps 200 yards, and at the end of the drive stood Hartwell Grange. Mary stopped at the gate posts and looked at it for a long moment before she went in. The house was a house of local stone, the color of wet oatmeal, 2 stories high with an attic range of dormers above, built in the plain, classical manner of 40 years earlier. 7 bays across the front, with a central pediment and a portico of 4 columns that had never received its steps. It was, she saw at once, a great house, and yet not a great house, for it had the proportions of consequence without the polish, and every window on the ground floor was shuttered with unpainted deal boards nailed across the frames, and the slates of the roof were patched with moss, and in 2 places had slipped and fallen, and left a black wound of laths showing through, and a downpipe on the east side had come away from its brackets and hung outward into the air like a broken arm. A carriage sweep of gravel and weed lay before the portico. Grass had grown up through the gravel in tufts and hummocks. A stone urn beside the door was cracked from top to bottom and stuffed with the black nest of some bird long departed. Mary walked up the drive with the tin sewing box under her arm and the deed inside it. She walked slowly because there was no need to hurry now, and because she wished to see everything as she came to it. The lime trees were untrimmed and had thrown their yellow leaves upon the drive in a wet slick. A young oak had seated itself in the middle of the carriage sweep and stood 3 feet high with 2 seasons of growth upon it, and Mary made a mental note to leave it another year and see if it would take a shape, because a tree that has chosen its own ground is worth more than a tree that has been planted. She came up to the portico and set her bag and her tin box upon the stone flags between the columns, and took the iron key from her pocket and put it into the lock of the front door. The lock turned stiffly and with a sound of grit, but it turned. Mary pushed the door open with her shoulder and stepped inside, and the air of the house came out to meet her, cold and dry and smelling of plaster dust and old timber, and the faint dead smell of a place that has been shut a long time without being wet. The entrance hall ran back 30 feet to a stone-flagged floor, and above it a plaster ceiling had been begun and not finished, the moldings running round 3 sides of the room and stopping halfway along the 4th, as though the plasterer had set down his tools at the end of a day and never come back. A great staircase of oak rose to a half-landing and turned, and the balusters were in place along the flight but not upon the landing, where 4 bare mortises in the handrail waited for the last set. A pair of double doors stood open on the right to a large room with a marble chimney-piece already fitted and a bare board floor and no skirting. A pair on the left gave upon a smaller room with a chimney-piece of black slate and the boards not yet laid, only the joists showing across the void. Mary went through the house room by room in the last of the light. She counted 14 rooms upon the ground floor and 12 above, and 6 attics under the roof, and of these she judged 4 downstairs and 3 upstairs to be fit in some measure for use, in that they had floors and glass and doors that shut, though none had been furnished and none had been fully finished. She found a kitchen at the back with a great range set into the wall and never lit, the iron still black with the maker's wax, and a scullery with a stone sink and a pump that gave, when she worked the handle, first a rusty trickle and then, after a full minute, a run of cold, clear water. She found a north corridor upon the ground floor that ran the length of the west wing and ended unexpectedly at a smooth wall of plain plaster where by all the logic of the building there ought to have been a door. She stood before that wall a moment in the failing light, and she laid her hand flat against it, and she felt the cold of it against her palm, and she went on because there was no candle yet, and she must find her way back to the village before dark. She locked the great door behind her with the iron key and walked the 3/4 of a mile back to the Ram, and Mrs. Bewley gave her a small room over the stable yard for 8d, and Mary ate a bowl of barley broth in the tap room and went to bed by 7 o'clock and slept without waking until the church bell struck 6 the following morning. She lay a while in the narrow bed and thought about the plaster wall at the end of the north corridor where there ought to have been a door, and by the time she had risen and washed and taken her breakfast of bread and tea, she had determined to open it. She bought at the village shop that morning 3 tallow candles, a box of lucifer matches, a hand broom, a small tin pail, and, from a man called Red Fern who kept the smithy and dealt also in second-hand tools, an iron pry bar, a claw hammer, a 2-pound mason's hammer, and a cold chisel. She paid 3 shillings and 4d for the lot, refused the offer of a boy to carry them, and walked back to the Grange with the tools bundled in her wool shawl and the tin sewing box under her other arm. She let herself in with the iron key, lit one of the tallow candles at the kitchen range, where she had that morning laid a small fire with sticks from the drive, and carried the light and the tools down the north corridor to the plaster wall. She looked at the wall a long time before she began. The plaster was old and dry and even, put on in 3 coats over lath, and the skirting ran up to it and stopped as if the wall had always been there. But when she held the candle close and looked along the join of skirting to floor, she saw that the skirting had been cut and mitered to fit against the plaster after the floor was laid, and that on the ceiling above, the plaster of the corridor met the plaster of the wall in a slightly raised seam that a plasterer finishing a proper corner would never have left. It was a stopping wall. It had been put up to close something off. She took the cold chisel and the mason's hammer, set the chisel at shoulder height in the center of the wall, and drove it in. The plaster cracked cleanly. She worked outward from that first hole in a slow, patient square, tapping and prying, until she had opened a gap perhaps 2 feet across and had exposed behind the plaster not brickwork, as she had half feared, but a course of lath, and behind the lath a plain deal door, its paint the color of dried mustard, with an iron knob and a keyhole. She stopped and set down the hammer and stood breathing for a moment in the plaster dust with the candle in her hand. She cleared the door frame with the pry bar. The lath came away in sheaves, and the door stood free, and she tried the knob, and the knob turned, and the door was not locked, only shut, and it opened inward upon dry hinges with a long, low complaint of dry wood. Mary held the candle up and stepped through. The wing beyond was 3 rooms and a small back stair. The air inside was drier than the air of the house behind her, because it had been sealed and the walls were sound. In the first room, which was a small parlor of perhaps 16 feet by 12, the plaster was finished, the skirting was fitted, the chimney-piece of veined marble was in place, and upon the mantel stood a pair of brass candlesticks, and between them a japanned tin dispatch box 11 inches long, in shape and manufacture almost the twin of Mary's own sewing box, though larger and with a small brass plate upon the lid. She set her candle in one of the candlesticks and lifted the dispatch box down and carried it to the wide sill of the shuttered window and set it there and opened it. Inside the box, on the top, lay a folded paper of 2 sheets sealed with a wafer of red wax. Beneath the paper lay 4 canvas bags tied at the neck with cord, and when she lifted one it was heavy in her hand with the particular dense weight that belongs to no other thing in the world, and when she loosened the cord and tipped a little of it into her palm, she saw the yellow of sovereigns, 30 or 40 in the one bag, and the 4 bags together, she judged without counting, held perhaps 150 pounds in gold. Beneath the bags, wrapped in a piece of blue silk, lay a small woman's brass thimble. worn smooth, and a folded square of linen embroidered along its edge with a border of yellow roses in silk thread, the same yellow roses, exactly, that had been stenciled upon the lid of Mary's tin sewing box at home. She sat down upon the bare board floor, with her back against the wall beneath the window, and held the thimble in one hand and the piece of embroidered linen in the other, and did not move for a long time. Then, in the yellow light of the tallow candle, she broke the red wafer and unfolded the 2 sheets of paper and read what was written there. The letter was written in a woman's hand, upright and careful, in ink that had faded to the color of weak tea. It began, "To whoever finds this room and this box, I ask your patience for a few lines. My name is Eliza Marsden, and I was housekeeper at Hartwell Grange from the summer of 1819 until the work ceased in the autumn of 1822. I came to the Grange a widow of 32 years, having lost my husband, a joiner of Rugby, and my only child, a daughter of 4 years, in the same 12-month of fever, and I took the place because I could not bear the house at Rugby any longer. Mr. Hartwell, who was building this grange, was a kind man of trade from Birmingham, and he trusted me with the keeping of accounts for the household and the workmen's dinners. When he died of a seizure in the September of 1822, and the work stopped and the men were paid off, there was money laid by for the finishing of the west wing that no one but he and I knew of, being kept in this box in this little parlor that was meant to be my sitting room. I stayed on 3 months alone, and closed the wing myself, as he had instructed, against the day his affairs might be settled and the works resumed, and I paid a plasterer from Coventry to stop the corridor, and I locked the door behind me on the last day, and I left the box where it stands. His heirs did not come. I am now going to my sister at Nuneaton, and I do not think I shall come again. I leave the money in the box for whoever finds this room, and I ask only that you use it kindly and finish something of what he began. The thimble was my daughter's grandmother's, and the linen I embroidered myself in the winter of my daughter's 2nd year. I have no one to leave them to. I hope you have a mother somewhere who loved you. Eliza Marsden, housekeeper, this 14th day of December, 1822. Mary folded the 2 sheets along their old creases and put them back into the dispatch box, and she sat on the boards a while longer, and then she rose and blew out the candle and went back through the broken plaster into the corridor and locked the front door with the iron key and walked down to the village in the gray afternoon light. She did not tell anyone at the Ram that evening what she had found. She ate her broth and drank her tea and went up to the little room over the stable yard and slept. In the morning she asked Mrs. Bewley for the direction of Mr. Halloway the younger's private house, and went to his door before he had left for the office, and she asked him whether a sum of money found in a sealed room of a property lawfully purchased belonged to the purchaser or to the estate of a former owner. Mr. Halloway, who had not yet had his 2nd cup of tea, considered the question with the care it was owed. He said that if the money had been placed there by a servant now deceased, and if no claim was made by any heir of the late Mr. Hartwell within the customary period, and if the deed of sale was clear of encumbrance, which it was, the money passed with the freehold to the purchaser. He asked whether Mary wished him to act. Mary said she did, and she paid him a retainer of 5 shillings out of the money in her handkerchief, and she did not yet mention the sum in the dispatch box. Mr. Halloway wrote that morning to the London firm that had wound up the Hartwell estate in 1823, and to the parish clerk of Nuneaton for any record of Eliza Marsden. By the end of the fortnight, he had answers from both. The Hartwell estate had been discharged of all claims in 1826 without residue. Eliza Marsden had died at Nuneaton in the winter of 1824, unmarried and without issue, and had left no will. Mr. Halloway drew up a short document affirming Mary Weaver's title to the contents of the sealed wing of Hartwell Grange, and Mary paid him 12 shillings and 6pence for the work, and she put the document into the dispatch box with the letter and the thimble and the linen. She began then the rebuilding of the Grange. She kept, out of the sovereigns in the 4 canvas bags, £140 for the works, and she opened an account at the branch of the county bank at Rugby in her own name, Mary Weaver, spinster, of Hartwell Grange, and she paid the money in over the counter in 3 journeys by carrier's cart, and she took away a small green passbook with her name written in a clerk's hand upon the flyleaf. The passbook she kept in the tin sewing box on the mantel of the little parlor that had been Eliza Marsden's, along with Eliza's letter and Eliza's thimble and her own mother's thimble beside it. The first work was the roof. She went to Redfern the smith and asked him the name of a slater, and he named Job Whitcomb, aged 51, of the village of Coatsbach, a man who had slated churches and barns for 30 years and kept his own ladders. Job Whitcomb came to the Grange on a Tuesday and walked the roof with Mary standing below in the wet grass, and he came down and said the roof needed 180 new slates of the Warwickshire green sort, and a full reflashing of the two valleys, and the replacing of 6 lengths of lead in the gutters, and he could do it in 3 weeks with a boy to help him for £18 and the boy's dinner. Mary said yes, and Job Whitcomb began on the Thursday. His boy was his youngest son, Ned, aged 14, quiet and quick on a ladder. Mary cooked their dinner every day in the kitchen range, which she had lit for the first time on the morning job began, having cleaned the maker's wax from the iron with a rag and a little lamp oil, and the range drew well and gave a good, even heat, and she made barley broth and dumplings and once a week a piece of boiled beef from the butcher at Hartwell. The second work was the downpipes and the front doorstep and the loose sash cords, which Mary asked of a carpenter named William Ashe, aged 37, of Hartwell village, a widower with 2 children who had learned his trade in Warwick. William Ashe brought his own bench and his own tools in a handcart and worked at the Grange for 4 weeks. He replaced 22 feet of downpipe in cast iron ordered from a foundry at Coventry. He laid 3 steps of dressed local stone under the portico where none had ever been laid. He recorded the sashes of the 14 rooms she meant to use, and he put new locks on the 2 outer doors. Mary paid him £9 4 shillings, and gave him a Sunday dinner in the kitchen with his children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, and the children sat quietly and ate boiled mutton and turnips, and the girl was allowed to hold the brass thimble that had been Mary's mother's while Mary washed the plates. The third work was the finishing of the plaster where the workmen of 1822 had stopped, and for this Mary sent by Mr. Halloway to Coventry for a plasterer named John Beadle, aged 44, who had learned his trade under a Frenchman in London and could run a moulding by hand. John Beadle came to the Grange for 3 weeks with an apprentice and a horse and cart of lime and hair and laths and moulds, and he finished the ceiling of the entrance hall along the 4th side to match the other 3, matching the egg and dart and the acanthus of the corners so nearly that Mary, standing beneath it with a candle when he was done, could not tell without effort where the old work ended and the new began. He charged her £7 and 10 shillings and stayed to dinner on the day he finished and drank a glass of small beer and said the man who had begun that ceiling had known his trade, and Mary said she was glad it had been finished at last. The kitchen garden was cleared by a man named Peter Ostler, aged 62, formerly under-gardener at a great house near Lutterworth, now living on a small pension with his daughter in the village. He came 3 days a week for 2 months for 1 shilling and 3 a day and his dinner, and he brought his own spade and his own long-handled hoe and a Hessian sack of onion sets and seed potatoes he had saved from his daughter's garden. He cleared the 4 beds of the walled garden of 20 years of couch grass and bramble. He pruned the 2 old apple trees against the south wall and the pear against the west. He set the onions and the potatoes and a row of winter kale. And he showed Mary how to lay a hedge properly along the drive where the lime trees ended, cutting the stems half through at the base and laying them at an angle and pegging them with hazel stakes. Mary paid him what was agreed, and at Christmas a shawl for his daughter, plain gray wool with a plaited fringe she had made herself in the evenings by the parlor fire. Word went about the parish, in the slow way of such places, that the young woman at the Grange was paying her tradesmen weekly in coin, was eating in her own kitchen off a scrubbed deal table, was mending her own linen by the fire, and was neither proud nor foolish. In the 2nd month, a Mrs. Ann Corley, aged 58, widow of the parish clerk and a needlewoman of long standing, came up the drive on a Wednesday afternoon with a small covered basket and knocked at the kitchen door, which Mary had begun to use as her front door. Mrs. Corley brought a loaf of bread of her own baking, a small crock of butter, and the offer that if Mary meant to make up curtains for the room she was opening, Mrs. Corley would come and help her cut and hem them for the price of her dinners. Mary said yes, and thanked her, and sat her down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and Mrs. Corley stayed till dusk and walked home with an empty basket and the promise to return on the Monday. They cut curtains together through the winter, at the long deal table in the kitchen where the range kept them warm, out of good plain wool serge, in a dark green Mrs. Corley had got from a draper in Rugby at trade price on Mary's behalf, and out of a bolt of unbleached calico for the linings, and they made 28 pairs of curtains in the course of 6 weeks, all lined and hemmed and hung on brass rings that William Ashe had fitted to poles of ash. He had turned himself on a pole lathe in his yard. When the last pair was hung, in the small dining room on the ground floor where Mary meant to eat her Sundays, Mrs. Corley stood back and looked at the room and said only, "They hang well," and Mary said, "Yes, they do." And the two women went down to the kitchen and had their tea. The vicar of Hartwell, the Reverend Mr. Amos Prentice, aged 49, called in the 3rd month with his wife, a small tidy woman named Hannah, and they sat in the little parlor that had been Eliza Marsden's, with a small fire in the grate, and the 2 thimbles on the mantel between the brass candlesticks, and they drank tea from a plain white pot Mary had bought at the market at Rugby for 1 and 6pence. The vicar asked, in his careful way, after Mary's people. Mary said she had none living. The vicar said the parish would be glad of her at church on a Sunday when she was ready. And Mrs. Prentice said more quietly that if Mary wished for company of an evening in the long winter, she would always be welcome at the vicarage. Mary thanked them both and did not promise, but on the Sunday of the following week she walked down to the parish church of St. Mary the Virgin at Hartwell, in her plain wool day dress, with her wool shawl and her bonnet, and she sat in a pew towards the back, and she stood and sat and knelt with the rest of the parish, and afterwards she shook the vicar's hand at the porch and walked home the 3/4 of a mile up the Coatsbach road, with the church bell striking 11 behind her. By the spring of 1861 she was known in the village as Miss Weaver of the Grange. Redfern the smith saluted her with a touch of his cap when she passed the forge. The butcher, whose name was Timothy Frost, kept her a piece of the best mutton on a Friday. The woman at the village shop, Mrs. Deacon, put by her tallow candles and her flour without being asked, and rolled up the bill against the 1st of each month, which Mary paid in coin. The Ram gave up her name at Christmas when the postmaster began delivering letters directly to the Grange, and the letters came addressed, Miss Mary Weaver, Hartwell Grange, Hartwell, near Rugby, in a variety of hands from the tradesmen at Rugby and Coventry, with whom she now had accounts. Small rituals formed. On Monday mornings Mrs. Corley came at 9 and worked until 3, and they ate a dinner of what was in the larder, and Mary paid her 1 and 6pence and gave her a loaf to take home. On Thursdays Peter Ostler came for his half-day in the garden, and Mary always had a hot dinner for him whatever the weather. On Fridays she walked down to the village with a market basket and paid her accounts and took her tea at Mrs. Corley's cottage in the lane behind the church. On Sundays she went to church at 11 and dined at 1 on whatever Mrs. Corley had helped her prepare on the Saturday. On the last Saturday of each month she wrote up her books at the kitchen table by candlelight. In a large ledger William Ashe had made her out of a stationer's blank at Rugby, and she entered her receipts and her payments in 2 columns in the neat, small hand Mrs. Gable had taught her 15 years before. The neighboring estate families, who had at first known nothing of her, now knew a little. Mrs. Ferrars of Coatsbach House, aged 60, called in April with her daughter and left a card and a jar of quince preserve. Sir Henry Lambton, of Bilton Park, aged 55, a widower who owned 3,000 acres east of Hartwell, called in May on horseback and stayed 20 minutes in the little parlor and admired the finished ceiling of the entrance hall and asked, without any impertinence, what plasterer she had employed, and rode away with the name of John Beadle written on the back of an envelope. None of them condescended, because Mary did not permit condescension, and none of them presumed, because Mary offered no ground for presumption. She gave them tea in plain cups, answered their questions plainly, and did not seek their acquaintance beyond what they themselves proposed. It was, in the slow, accumulating manner of a Warwickshire parish, enough. On an evening in June of 1861, Mary sat in the little parlor that had been Eliza Marsden's, with the shutters folded back and the last light coming in low across the lime trees, and she looked at the mantel. On the mantel stood the 2 brass candlesticks Eliza had left, and between them the tin sewing box with the yellow roses stenciled on the lid, and upon the tin box the 2 thimbles side by side, her mother's brass thimble that had come from Coventry in her pocket, and Eliza Marsden's daughter's thimble that had waited 40 years behind a plaster wall. Beside them lay the square of linen embroidered with yellow roses, and Eliza's letter folded along its old creases, and the green passbook of the county bank at Rugby. Mary thought of Mrs. Gable, who had taught her the neat small hand in which she now wrote up her ledger, and of her mother Anne, who had left her only a thimble, and of her father Thomas, who had died in his chair with the paper on his knees, and of Eliza Marsden, who had closed the wing in the winter of 1822 and gone to her sister at Nuneaton and left the money for whoever came. She thought of Mrs. Fenn, who had put her out of the room above the pie shop, and of the cousin in Yorkshire who had not answered, and of the former customer who had refused because circumstances had altered, and she found she bore none of them any grudge, because they had, without knowing it, sent her along the road to Hartwell. Mary Weaver was 21 years old, and she had nowhere to go. She had 11 shillings in a handkerchief and a tin sewing box and a wool shawl, and she spent £3 sterling on an unfinished mansion in a Warwickshire parish that nobody else would take. It was the best £3 she ever spent. If this story has stayed with you, do subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who understands the quiet worth of work and patience, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what small thing in your own life, once thought worthless, turned out in the end to be the beginning of a home.